Today's video, I'm coming at you guys with a ban list impact tier list. So it's just to be clear, this is not a prediction, this is not a wish list. I've gathered together some different cards that I've seen across different people's ban list predictions and wish lists, compiled them together, and I'm sort of going to be just going over how I feel like if these hits should happen, like how would their impact on the current format be. So once again, this is not a prediction or a wish list, but rather I'm just categorizing how impactful some of these hits actually would be. Also, just to clarify, these tiers are in regards to impacting the whole metagame. So while a certain change might have a big impact on a single deck or two, what I'm considering here is how it will affect most of the decks in the meta or the general metagame as a whole. So keep that in mind when I put things in these different tiers. And with that being said, let's hop straight into it. So the first card being banned being Droll and Lockbird, I absolutely think this will have a high impact on the meta should it happen. A lot of decks are sort of gatekept by this card. It does definitely allow you when you're going second against those hyper combo decks or decks that search a lot to give you some sort of semblance of a chance, because then your opponent won't be able to fully pop off. So should Droll and Lockbird get banned, I think absolutely will have a very high impact in this format. Abyss Dweller, I think Abyss Dweller, if it should get banned, it probably have some impact. Once again, it's not good against every single deck out there. Not every single deck can make it. It'll probably make cards like Xyz's Encore see a little bit less play because now it doesn't have that coverage into Pearly as well as the Abyss Dwellers. But once again, like I mentioned, not every deck is going to lose to it. Not every deck was able to make it, so it probably wouldn't be as impactful as some of these other staples getting hit would be. Next up is if you hit DVV Wave King Caesar for Unchained. So in terms of hits to Unchained, I didn't really see that many in other people's lists, and the one common thing I sort of saw was potentially hitting Caesar and just banning it outright, just so the Unchained cards are still able to play as a deck on its own. You just wouldn't have a powerful card like Caesar for follow-up and disruption. You'd probably just be ending a lot more on Unchained Interruption, and I think that'd be okay for the deck. It'd probably still be pretty competitive, but this hit would definitely be pretty impactful, like, to the Unchained deck. It sort of shift the way Unchained is probably played, but also the way that people side deck against Unchained, because now cards that would otherwise lose to Caesar now have a better chance of going through when going second and playing against Unchained. I think that would be pretty strong. So if this were to get hit, then I do think Unchained would definitely take a hit, and the meta would sort of change a little bit around it, as well as people prepare for the deck differently now. Next up, if Shifter was banned, I think this would probably be, like Droll, a very high impact hit to the format. It's a very big blowout that'd be taken out of the format, and a lot of those graveyard based decks can now breathe a sigh of relief because they no longer have to deal with Shifter when they're going through their turn. And I think that not only would graveyard decks see some relief, but also just generally like mid-range decks that sometimes use a graveyard no longer have the opportunity to play these like blowout cards against some graveyard based decks, because no deck would have access to the Dimension Shifter anymore. So I think that overall would be a very high impact hit should it happen. Next up is Anti-Spell Fragrance. I think Anti-Spell is probably like at the top of some impact, bottom of high impact. The only reason I'm not really putting it in high impact is because I think that not every deck is playing it at the moment, and even decks that do choose to side floodgates when going first haven't really been choosing to go with Anti-Spell lately. Like, I think there are some decks that definitely get hindered by Anti-Spell, but now with the release of SP Little Knight and decks pretty much always being able to make it, I think it becomes a little easier to out Anti-Spell now, and I think that for that reason, it would have some impact if it were to get hit on the ban list. Next up is King Calamity. King Calamity is interesting because it's only really used in one deck at the moment, that being Centurion. Like, yes, a couple of other decks can play it, but even if you take it out of Centurion, it's not like the deck doesn't do anything. It's still able to set up some negates with Cosmic Blazer and such. So I think for that reason, it actually be a pretty low impact hit, but I just want to make myself clear. I'm not saying it shouldn't get hit, because I personally do think this card has no place in this game, and it would be good to get rid of it for the future. But in terms of how it would affect the meta, since it would only really affect one deck, it doesn't particularly change the format too much in my opinion, considering that deck wasn't even that popular to begin with. Next up is Isolt. I think Isolt will definitely have a decent amount of impact. Not only is it a significant part of the Infernoble deck, it's also a pretty big part of a lot of the degenerate like warrior combo decks out there, and just getting rid of this card I think would absolutely make it so It's a little bit easier to go second now. You won't have to worry about getting quote-unquote FTK'd or full combo by like Infernoble Knights or other warrior strategies now. And I think that that might actually make it so hand traps are actually somewhat less required than they might be should this card still stay around. So I think that it definitely have some impact on the format. Next up are Agito and Kelbeck. I also do think these will have some impact as well. Probably like on the lower end of it, because it does really only affect like the tier limits deck. Next up is Harpy's Featherstorm. I think Harpy's Featherstorm is probably like on the top of low impact, bottom of some impact. And once again, I'm not saying this card shouldn't be banned, but I'm saying that if it were to get hit, since it's only played in Fluanderies, like that's just one deck losing one unsearchable card that they're not even seeing every game anyways. So I think that in terms of how it would change the format, it's not as significant as some of these other cards are. And the reason I say this compared to like something like Caesar, for example, is because since Unchained is quite popular of a deck and people are actively preparing for it, I think that you can't really prepare for this, whereas Caesar, you might have actually built your deck or chose your tech cards in a way that it'll actually have some impact against a Caesar. Next up is Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. I think similarly with these three other cards, like personally, I do think this card should go, but in terms of if it actually did go, it probably would have like very little impact on the meta, considering Branded Despia isn't a very popular deck, and not every deck version of that deck is actually playing it. I think there's like synchro builds out there, so you may not even play this in all your Branded Despia decks. So for that reason, I think it wouldn't be very impactful of a hit. Next up is Eradicator Epidemic Virus. This was a big problem a little while back, but now I think that it probably have some impact, considering that this is still a pretty big blowout against some of the decks out there, especially in Labyrinth where you can set it from your deck. But aside from that, it hasn't really been seeing as much play as it has in the past. So while I do think it'll be nice if this card leaves, I don't think that it'll have a significant meta impact like some of these other hits would. And then Dimensional Barrier. I think Dimensional Barrier would actually probably be like at the bottom of high impact, lower than these two, but still pretty significant because Dimensional Barrier definitely checks a lot of the decks out there. Top decks like Pearly, for example, get hit pretty hard by it. And the fact that it's thrustable, it's settable off of the Labyrinth cards, I think that having this card eliminated from the format entirely, I think will definitely change it quite a bit. It'll make it so those more like XE, Synchro, Fusion-based decks have a better chance when going second into boards, and I think that'll be pretty high impact for the game. Next up is Emergency. If it were to get limited, I probably say it doesn't really matter. Rescue Ace will still be a pretty strong deck, and it won't really change the way the deck plays, except perhaps it won't have as strong of a follow-up. Its consistency will be slightly reduced, but aside from that, I really don't think this hit would be that impactful. Next up is Tearlament Scream. I think Tearlament Scream is like sort of at the top of low impact. Like once again, like Emergency, you can still play Tearlaments without it. I would say losing Scream to 1 hurts Tearlaments probably a bit more, because Scream was not only one of the best cards to mill, but also one of the best cards to put on the board, so you can get your play started. And I think that if Scream were to get limited, it probably have a pretty decent impact on Tearlament, but once again, like it probably wouldn't remove Tearlament from the format, so I think it'd probably be a low impact hit overall. Next up are Tidal and Redox, if they were to come back to 1. So in my personal opinion, I don't think these would be very high impact. Like, yes, their effects are pretty solid, but I hesitate to really put them that high up. I might just consider putting them in low impact, because I really don't think a lot of decks can take full advantage of their effects unless I'm missing something very obvious. And I think that now with the speed of the game, like it doesn't really do that much outside of a select few decks that purposely try to build to like take advantage of these like Dragon Ruler effects. So I'm gonna put them at the bottom of low impact. I really don't think they'd affect the format that much. Next up is if Fenrir 1-1, and I think if Fenrir 1-1, that actually be like pretty significant for the format, because Fenrir is one of the most generically splashed cards in a lot of decks right now, especially with SP Little Knight being a thing. If it were to go to 1, a lot of decks lose one of their best outs to SP Little Knight, essentially because it wouldn't really be worth playing at 1 outside of like a Kashira deck, for example. So if you were just to play a single Fenrir, you're going to see it a lot less often, and SP Little Knight's probably going to be able to stick on the board a little bit more often than it does right now, and I think that'd definitely be pretty impactful for the format, so I'm going to put it in the high impact tier. Next up is super polymerization. I also think super polymerization is in a similar boat as Fenrir, albeit it's less generic, so I'll probably put it at the top of some impact. If it were to get limited, it probably wouldn't be seeing play anymore unless you're playing a deck that can search it. If this card were to get limited, that means a lot of decks no longer have to worry about like certain end boards just being wiped out by like a single card. So like end boards like Baron and SP Little Knight wouldn't get wiped out by Guilty Gearfried anymore. Baron and Dispowder wouldn't get wiped out by Draco Quest anymore. And I think that it definitely be impactful against quite a few decks out there. But once again, it's not as generic of a card as Fenrir. So I do think it wouldn't be as high impact as Fenrir, but it definitely have some shakeups in the meta for sure. Next up is if Grass came to one, and I know this is a very interesting one. I saw it on Jesse Cotton's sort of like wish list, and I thought it was interesting to put in here because his reasoning was that if you are going second, and even if you're playing just a 40 card deck and your opponent's comboed off, you can like thrust for this and then mill like 10 cards or something like that, and that'd still be pretty cool. Was sort of what he was saying. In my opinion, I definitely do think this would have a decent amount of impact if it were to come back. I don't think there'd be that many decks trying to build around it. I guess it really would depend on if a card like Shifter's still around, because Shifter would sort of check those like crazy like 60 card mill decks. But in my opinion, if it were to come back, I'd probably put it like at the very bottom of some impact. Like maybe I'm overestimating how strong this card is or underestimating how strong it is, but in my opinion, it'd be like a decently impactful card that can be played in quite a few decks and sort of warp the way deck building is done in the format. So I do think if this card were to come back to one, it actually impact the format like a decent amount. Next up is if Talents went to one. I think that if Talents went to one, it'd probably be like decently impactful. The only reason I'm saying that is because once again, Talents has not really been played in a lot of different decks out there, and plus at one you can still access it with Thrust, so it's not like you would really lose access to Talents. So I feel like losing 2 Talents is like okay. It doesn't really do too much to the decks that would play Talents because they can just swap those for Thrust. But aside from that, I'd say that Talents is, of course, a very strong card, and it definitely impact the meta in some way if it were to get limited, because now people would know that Thrust is like almost always going to be able to be people will now know that if you're able to like stop a Thrust, for example, they're most likely not going to have like a Talents to punish you or something like that. Or if you're trying to hand trap your opponent's not going to be able to punish you with Talents as often, because even if they have Thrust, like it doesn't do anything if you have no monsters on the board, right? So I think that'd have some impact in the format if it were to get limited. Next up is Pot of Prosperity. I think that Pot of Prosperity would absolutely be pretty impactful if it were to get limited to one. It takes away a big consistency piece of significant portion of the meta, and it definitely makes it so you're going to have to be a little smarter about like the consistency choices and the that you put into your deck. You want to make sure it's consistent enough even without access to Pot of Prosperity. So I think that if it were to get limited, it definitely have a significant impact and hurt the consistency of a lot of these meta decks out there. Now, it by no means like outright kills any of the meta decks, but I think that by limiting it to one, it'll absolutely have a significant impact and make it so it's difficult for some decks just to have just such access to such a powerful card, both going first and going second. Next up is Pearly Sleepy Memory. Being limited is probably in like a similar boat as the DDD Wave King Caesar if it were to get banned, because Pearly is of course a very significant deck. People are side decking for Pearly as they are for Unchained, and I think that hurting Pearly in this way would make it so it would be a lot weaker of a deck. I wouldn't say it's like outright dead by any means, but it definitely becomes a lot weaker if Pearly Sleepy Memory gets limited to 1, because now it's a lot harder for your opponent to have access to their first turn Noir, and a lot of the times they might be just passing with a worse end board than they normally would have, and that'll definitely affect the way people view the deck as a meta threat or not, in my opinion. So I think it'll have some impact in the format. Next up is Big Welcome Labyrinth, and once again, like I think it falls in a similar boat. Labyrinth is still definitely going to be playable. Labyrinth is going to lose a bit of its grind game, so I think that it would hurt Labyrinth a decent amount. And once again, like these other 2 decks, Labyrinth is a pretty powerful deck in the meta right now, so I think it absolutely have some impact to the meta overall. Vicious Astrolabe, also similar boat as this. I would say like a little bit lower impact because Vanadium isn't as popular as some of these other decks out there. But by no means would Vanadium be dead or anything. Like these other tier 1 decks out here, I think that just hitting like one of those cards that takes away one part of their key engine overall would have some impact because these are the top decks. It will definitely weaken them, but it's not going to like completely take them out of the meta. I wouldn't put these as like high impact hits in my opinion. And finally, moving on to the unlimits, I think that if Pankratops were to come back to 3, it probably have like some impact. I don't think it's like completely irrelevant, especially if Fenrir gets limited to 1. Like Pankratops might be seen as like the next best option because it is a very strong out to SP Little Knight, and if a lot of decks are just ending on SP Little Knight, then it's going to help you trade very well into those boards going second. Almost always going to be like a 2-for-1 at minimum. And I think that for that reason, it might be pretty impactful. Now, I hesitate to put in high impact because I don't think every deck would go to play this, because this is a little different from Fenrir in the sense that you can't really use it when going first, and it doesn't really generate you more resources like Fenrir would. So for now, I would just put in some impact. Next up is Pot of Desires if it were to go to 3. I think this is probably a pretty low impact chain. I think shifting it from 2 to 3 doesn't really matter at all. Like it might incentivize some decks to consider playing it once again, especially if Pot of Prosperity gets limited. Then I guess it would be a much more impactful move. But if Pot of Prosperity stays the same, then moving Desires from 2 to 3 doesn't really matter in my opinion. Next up is Masterpiece. I think this is the first change I would say is pretty much negligible. I don't think Masterpiece going to 3 would really change anything. For the format, the True Draco deck is pretty bad. Even with Masterpiece, I think it's still pretty bad, considering we have very powerful towers in the form of Expert Noir in the format right now. So decks are already playing out to cards that are supposed to be unaffected, and Masterpiece is not even completely unaffected by everything. There's always going to be something that can affect it too. So even if you don't have non-engine to out it, like in theory, there's always a way for your deck to actually get rid of it still. Finally, Gamma if it came back to 3. I know this one is a little bit more controversial. Once again, I saw it on Jesse Con's like wish list, and I think that it's not like completely out of the picture. That's why I decided to put it in my list. But I think that should Gamma come back to 3, it definitely be a very high impact. I'd say it's like up there with like getting rid of these hand traps, because Gamma coming back to 3 now means people have to go back to thinking about when should I use my hand traps, and that'll sort of warp the way people think about hand traps, but also the way they build their decks and the way that they structure their plays in a turn. And this affects like every single deck out there essentially. So I think that should Gamma come back to 3, it'll definitely start seeing play again, and it would definitely be a very big shake up to the meta, because every deck now has access to this very powerful card that can sort of protect them from hand traps or just be a super high impact card when going second. So that's going to do it for my ban list impact list. So once again, I want to reiterate, this is not a prediction, not a wish list, but rather I just gathered other people's predictions and wish lists and put them on here. I put the cards that I personally felt would be the most plausible for it to happen. So there was some subjectivity in terms of that. But once again, like, this is not meant to be like a prediction or a wish list of any sort. I'm just saying hypothetically, if these changes were to happen, like how would it affect the meta overall? So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this new style of video. I'm probably going to try something like this every ban list season, as opposed to giving my wish list and prediction, because you can see those from other YouTubers. Rather, I just want to sit down and analyze like what are the most popular things that are potentially going to get hit on this ban list and how they would affect the format. So with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.